And so when Navalny died, for a lot of people, it was really the death of not just this political figure that was popular and beloved by a lot of people, but also the death of this hope and the sort of vision for a better country.
Every day, as you know, on Times Radio, we remember our colleague, the Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich. It is now 341 days since he was detained in Russia. That's coming up to a year almost. Events there are developing fast. Thousands of people have been visiting the grave of Alexei Navalny, the late Russian opposition leader who died in a Russian prison. His family say he was murdered by the Putin regime. Francesca Ebel is a Washington Post correspondent. She's in Moscow and has been covering the funeral and the queues. Good morning to you, Francesca.
Hi there. Hi.
I've seen some photograph. I mean, all the photographs, all the video was real lump in the mouth, lump in the throat stuff. And the photograph of his grave as well, just completely drowning in flowers. Give us an idea of what you've seen and what you felt really while you've been there.
Yeah, it's definitely been a sort of watershed moment for a lot of liberal Russians who have stayed in Russia, because, as you know, since the invasion, a lot of people who were against the war and against the government, they left Russia and they sort of fled into exile. But for those that stayed, it's got increasingly difficult and increasingly sort of hopeless, or that's how they feel. They feel this growing sense of powerlessness. There's been these really intense waves of political repression. And so when Navalny died, for a lot of people, it was really the death of not just this political figure that was popular and beloved by a lot of people, but also the death of this hope and the sort of vision for a better country. And so the scenes really at the cemetery, both the funeral and the cemetery, have been pretty wrenching and quite emotionally crushing. I mean, I think when I got finally to the graveside on Saturday, there were still hundreds of people turning up to lay flowers, and the police presence was still incredibly intense. They'd set up these metal detectors fitted with video cameras, which was a sign that they'll be potentially logging people's faces in Moscow's surveillance system. So a hugely intimidating atmosphere, but people still turned up, and everyone was just really in floods of tears. It was pretty devastating to see, actually.
So what were people allowed to do and not allowed to do? Is there a line that they couldn't cross, so to speak? Not a physical line, but a kind of behavioural line?
Yeah, so the police obviously were sort of checking people's bags and checking people's IDs and sort of letting them come in a very deeply controlled way. And then they had sort of cordoned off this sort of queue area around the grave, but people were only really allowed to spend a few seconds there. If you stood for too long, you'd get shouted at by the police to move on. So, you know, if you're turning up as someone that wants to really properly say farewell, you need a few minutes to take in the sight of the tombstone, to really like visually accept in your mind that this person is gone. And just no one was given that space. It was still this really dark, repressed atmosphere.
Now, the Kremlin, of course, denies involvement in Navalny's death. Do you have any idea of how long this particular kind of outpouring of support, grief, etc., for Navalny will continue? Do you think it will peter out, or do you think it's going to continue?
It's difficult to say because there were really a mix of emotions on Friday and Saturday. There was obviously deep grief and deep sadness, but there were these sort of glimmers of hope. And I think I wasn't in this section of the crowd, but I know from my colleagues and also video of the march or procession afterwards that there were these anti-war chants, which is very I mean, very surprising to me, certainly, because in the section that I was, people were still very scared. And if anyone was talking about politics or corruption or Putin, people would shush them and tell them
Mm.
to speak quietly. So there was still this fear within this moment of feeling like for the first time in 2 years, they could gather and they could say these slogans and they could shout Navalny's name. But still, there was this terror of the surrounding policemen and the sort of video surveillance and the waiting police vans. So I think there definitely is, some people definitely felt this sort of return of hope and optimism and sort of seeing that, you know, even though there were these massive risks and even though there was this clear message that there were these high risks and potential risks. Thousands of people turned out and they kept coming. And I think people found a lot of comfort in that.
Yeah.
But, the stakes are still so high.
Well, absolutely. Before you go, Francesca, I must ask you then about your colleague. Obviously, you're a correspondent at the Washington Post. Your colleague, the Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, we say his name and how many days he has been detained for in Russia every day. What is your sense of what is going to happen there? And also, I mean, as much as you can say, bearing in mind where you are, about how you feel about doing your own job.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for continuing to say Evan's name and draw attention to his case. We're all, as his friends and colleagues, were pretty, devastated that it's almost a year now that he's been detained on absurd charges of espionage for the last year. In answer to your first question, at this point, I really have no idea. We're sort of waiting and hoping that there will be some kind of exchange. Putin himself has signaled that he has someone in mind who's in Germany, but there's really nothing we can do. We just have to sort of wait and see and hope. But at this point, it is very difficult and very painful. And in answer to your second question, it's something that I keep in mind every day. I'm a good friend of Evan's, and I never stop thinking about him and where he's at, and certainly it has impacted my decision to come here and how I operate. But yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Francesca, I think you've said it all without saying it.